as you can see, we brought a whole group of folks to talk about mobility and access. And I'm really excited because there's going to be a diversity of experience and perspectives here. So rather than have me tell you about their backgrounds and their work, I thought what better way than to have the folks that are doing it themselves bring this into discussion. So Tina, I'm going to have you go first. Introduce yourself very briefly, what you do. And then also, we have 3 themes that we have to tackle in this panel. What is mobility? What is accessibility? And what is, how do they link together? So we're going to start with, how do you define access in the work that you do? So a little bit about who you are and what is access.
Hi, I'm Tina Unterländer. I'm the Director of Innovation for VW Credit, which is Volkswagen Group's financial services arm to help basically our end consumers get into our vehicles. The way I would define access is really providing access to mobility, and mobility is obviously a very broad term, and I know there's a lot of different interpretations, but to me, and in my world very specifically, because I'm looking at from the financial side of things, is really how can I help provide access to mobility to our consumers from a financial perspective. What kind of tools, services, financing options can we provide to really make mobility possible?
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Mark De Laverne. I'm the Chief of Mobility Innovation for the City of Detroit. My work is focused on essentially getting new types of services and technologies up to make it easier for folks to get around the city. As far as access, I think I really focus on making sure the things that we're doing works for as many people as we can make that, and that's physical access, social access, economic access. Just working through all different use cases so that we can try to do as best we can to make sure these types of things work for everyone.
Hi, my name is Dinah Nucera. I reside here in Detroit. And my work previously was doing a lot of work within a coalition building around digital justice and thinking about what access looks like, not just in a form of having the ability to gain information, but to be able to produce and not just consume. And within that then leads to agency. So my work really, and my interests are really involved in how we offer agency to those specifically who have been marginalized from infrastructure or different access. So for me, access means power, and my work is all about bringing that power to marginalized communities.
Hello, my name is Falk Bothe. I'm the Director of the Digital Transformation Office at Volkswagen, and I've been working a lot around the mindset that is necessary to really collaborate and understand what digital transformation is all about and what we can do to create the best possible services, not only for our customers, but also for the communities we serve. So for me, access means access to all the necessary information and to the relevant stakeholders to get everybody at one table and to get into real good dialogue on what needs to be done and what services do the customers and the citizens really need.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jamie Jr. I am the Chief Operating Officer of our grassroots organization here in the city of Detroit, called Warriors on Wheels for Metro Detroit. I'm a lifelong Detroiter. I've done a lot of work in community economic development. I'm a really strong advocate of economic justice for marginalized people, particularly those within the disability community for which financial access is sometimes a huge barrier. Access to me means freedom. I can agree with everybody here that it is a conjoining of the ability to grasp resources that can help you integrate yourself into society. I think it's a concept of universal access, that we make sure that everyone from, and this is more of how I learned it as a child, it was more of a biblical reference, from the least to the greatest. If you create a world that is accessible to someone who is the least able to manage or navigate, then you have a society that will be fruitful because each person will be able to contribute.
That's great. Thank you so much. So I want to pick up on a couple of threads that actually were already introduced, both in terms of mindset, but one of the things that I've always loved about working in mobility is that link to freedom. So I'm thrilled that came out so quickly already. One of the things our organization did as a nonprofit focused on mobility education was think about how do we even define that. So I want to throw out a definition of mobility and maybe see if folks have reactions to it here on the panel, what's missing or what's really important in that. A lot of times we think about mobility as getting from point A to point B. It's very functional, either for us as people moving around or the stuff that supports us. But also we've thought about the movement of data and information as part of the mobility story. Obviously new business models we'll talk about, but also this benefit to society. I think that's a theme we've already heard here at Republica this week is these services in a vacuum can't exist anymore. And so I'd love to just, with those couple key components, see if anybody here on the group has a reaction to that. As a way to introduce mobility into this discussion. We've only got a couple mics, so we'll shuffle them.
I'm happy to start. From my perspective, it really resonates with me what you just said, because what I've seen and noticed, especially in my job as kind of looking forward and looking into the future as the head of innovation to really anticipate how the world is changing and how we need to change within that world. A lot of things that I've noticed is that we're not really acting as part of a larger ecosystem. We're really working a lot in silos, and I think that has been to our own detriment. The OEMs work on their new vehicles and their new transportation methods. On the financial services side, we're trying to figure out how to then help finance these options. Then you have the whole slew of micro-mobility options that came into the market. I think last year was like one of these mega years of $3.8 billion investment from a venture capital perspective to really get this micro-mobility market off the ground. But then when I see all of these things, I mean, especially when you look at micro-mobility, and I see it here in Detroit as well, you have the scooters laying around everywhere. There is not really a great structure. We see people love taking those scooters and they have fun while they're doing that, but then somehow the pieces are not quite connected. So to me, as part of my work, what I'm trying to do is really help within our own organization, within VW Group, really start to think more about the larger picture and what it means to provide mobility to the masses. And I mean really to everyone, including people with disabilities that not easily can get from A to B and use even some of the newest micromobility options in that sense. So that's what it really means to me.
So I want to talk a little bit about what I feel like what you're talking about is the external mobility, which is more aligned with being able to participate in your environment. And thinking about, so I want to talk a little bit about the internal mobility, about how you're able to move and create and to be able to shape your environment, which I think there's like a very big separation in that, because the words mobility and freedom are quite personal to people, and they depend on context, they depend on neighborhood, they depend on who you are and what you're able or not able to do. So in this, and this is what I've seen a lot in Detroit, is that each neighborhood has a completely different need. So then what are we doing in order to allow the conversations and the innovation that can happen at the grassroots level to then interject and inform the external development of mobility? So I know this is a little abstract where we have the external and the internal, but I think a lot about like what does it take for us to be our whole selves? And I think our environment like truly shapes that. And I think from the information exchange that we have online and the mobility of of information and the ability to connect, where this is an international audience, like we are in a phase within our lives in which we have to think about where we want to go with our quality of life. What is the world that we're trying to build? And I think that requires both to have an internal mobility to be able to create and participate, as well as an external mobility to be able to navigate these worlds that are being developed. Hopefully that all makes sense.
Yeah, I think I again agree with everything that's been said. I think that rather than thinking of mobility as a linear process, point A to point B, we should think of it as a cylindrical process, because once you get from point A to point B, you have to get back to point A again. And it goes to that internal mindset, right? We move in our thought process, right? We're mobile in our thoughts. You hear people talk about upward mobility in relationships to financial resources or a lifespan, right? So I think it's more of a cylindrical process, that mobility is wherever we tend to be.
Yeah, my definition of mobility is still adding up on what has already been said, because I have 2 kids. My wife and me, we are both full-time employees, and mobility also means to have the freedom to organize everything around daily life. So if you go out of the house and you're longer away from home, then somebody should take care of the garden, for example, or the kids need to go to school or to sports or to the gym in the afternoon. So for us, mobility is not only getting us from point A to B and back, but it's also who is going to take care of the kids, and do we have to drive by ourselves, or do we get this organized? Do we get things delivered, and so on and so on. So there are many things that have to be taken into account in mobility, and it's not just people moving, but within the cities, it's also several other things like goods and waste. And of course, in our family, the things that our kids do in the afternoon. So how do we organize this all when everybody else is working?
So I've been at this job here in Detroit for about 3 years, and one of the really great parts of this job is being able to learn and be able to talk to folks about, you know, the challenges of getting them around. And I think that one of the things that we've, you know, we're about 3 years in, is, you know, there's just so much, and it's focused on the A to B, and not just to build on your point on like the whole self, right? And like when you know, you talk to doctors or hospitals, like they don't sort of try to solve just for one thing, like they're trying to sort of solve for all aspects of it. And, you know, we have funding that's just focused on job access, right? Like we get federal funding and it's a program, which is great, but that's one piece that doesn't sort of talk about, well, how about getting kids to 2 different schools that they need to get to? One may be on the east side, one might be on the west side, and then getting to a job out in the suburbs. You know, we talk to health insurers and Medicaid, and, you know, they're focused on just sort of the trip to the doctor, but not trip to fresh food, trips to getting them with their friends so that, you know, their mental health is also there. And it's, you know, you start to sort of look at the ecosystem of just how, you know, what's needed to create good quality of life. And it's not just this A to B, right? Like it's solving for the whole, it's not even solving, it's addressing an entire ecosystem of what's needed. And it's a bigger challenge. And, you know, I think that mobility affects outcomes, all different outcomes, from social to economic to health outcomes across the city. And it's important, like this is kind of where we're getting to, is really beginning to understand, you know, how it's really affecting the outcomes, where there's potential business models and ROIs for that, and then beginning to say, like, how do we fill these gaps in, both from transporting someone from A to B, but also figuring out how we can pay for that as well.
So I think what's interesting to me, even in just down the line here, there's emerged some different lenses. There's the internal, external, there's solving the trip versus the journey, there's the symptom versus the illness, the ecosystem, and the like. I want to draw on another one, because as I was thinking about this discussion, it could be happening anywhere in the world, because many of these needs to create access and mobility are universal. So I want to start with the Detroiters on the panel and ask you to reflect on, in this question of access and mobility, what is uniquely Detroit? And then I'm going to ask our global partners on the table, what is perhaps more universal, or what are you seeing in the other communities that you're working in? Because I think it's an important part of this dichotomy in this discussion. So, Jamie, you've got a mic, so I'll have you go first.
Sure. Being a lifelong Detroiter, mobility in the arena of Detroit is very interesting, because we're one of the largest city masses in the country, right? So things are spread out. We have a large east side, we have a large west side, we have, this idea of suburban connections like a big wheel. But as time has went on, things are more spread out. So mobility is more of a life issue. Mr. Vergne brought up the idea of connecting to mental health. And I'll even say there's a concept called internalized ableism. Well, first of all, ableism is the idea that the world is designed for people who have the least mobility needs, such as a person, a building may have 4 stairs to enter, right? And no other way to get in. Well, it doesn't take into consideration the person with the stroller, the person with the wheelchair, the person with the cane. So that's just a little snippet of ableism. The world is pretty much designed for the people who designed it. But internalized ableism is this concept where the person feels broken in relationship to the system. As opposed to trying to change the outside system, we internalize this and say, well, I must be broken. I must need to be fixed because the world does not make room for me. So in terms of that, it creates this idea of isolation, right? That definitely leads to more illness, if you wanted to say that. The ability to not get around, not have access, not embrace equity. I think in our country we have held up this idea of equality, which I think now we should be moving, pun somewhat intended, we should be moving toward this idea of equality, of equity, where everyone has what they need to access every piece of society.
Detroiters, okay. Thank you, Jamie. So what is uniquely Detroit? Detroit's amazing, by the way, if you didn't know. And what I think is uniquely Detroit is that there has been such a lack of resources and such a lack of leadership in the history of the governance of Detroit that communities had to create a lot of solutions. And I was thankful to be and honored to be a part of a community movement called the Digital Stewards. And we realized, I think it was 2013, an article came out from Bill Callahan that showed us that 40% of Detroiters have no internet access at all. And that's mobile and a broadband or any kind of connection. So a lot of people think mobile phones, people just use that. But 40% of Detroiters had no connection at all. So that creates a really intense issue about people being able to access information or resources because stuff like social services are all online, and you could just imagine how you use the internet every day and what it would be like to not have it. Pretty different style of life. So what that creates then are these like specific pockets of neighborhoods that are creating these solutions. And our solution back in 2010 was to apply to the Broadband Technology Opportunity Program, which was an Obama administration stimulus funding, to try to build our own infrastructure. Because at the heart of this, it's infrastructure that we're talking about, and whether or not the infrastructure includes all the different perspectives that live within a city or live within the world. And so, like Jamie said, oftentimes these things are designed for the people who design it, and the issue that we've been seeing is that there's not enough people who face the issues themselves that are part of the creative process. So the digital stewards were essentially wireless technicians that were taught and raised within their own neighborhoods to build their own internet. And it was all about creating education that people could be able to then demystify this infrastructure that exists. Because like, how many of you know what it takes or what it has to go through to even build any mobility within this city? Or how many of you know like how the internet works? It's kind of not something we think about. These are just systems we use and we take for granted. So what does it mean then for communities to understand that and then build their own? And that's what's uniquely Detroit, is that we've had to build our own governance systems, we've had to build our own internet, we've had to build our own food banks, we've had to build our own coalitions within the city to advocate for stuff. We've built our own bills, like as far as like what people can access. So what is uniquely Detroit is this combination and this potential collaboration between community solutions and city governance and city infrastructure.
So again, only been here 3 years, but I think one of the things that is uniquely is the city did go through bankruptcy, and just on the DDOT, which is our transit side, is we cut a significant amount of revenue hours over from like 2000 to 2014. And I think Diana and Jamie can probably give experiences of what it was like to ride the bus in 2013 and 2014, as well as from residents, and it was not pleasant. Buses wouldn't show up for 2 hours, which is just criminal. And we've made a lot of investments in our transit here. Where we went from 0 to 12 24-hour routes in the city. We've got new buses rolling out. We put a new paint scheme so it looked a little bit more modern from the 1972 logo that we continue to use. We have Wi-Fi on the buses. We're making investments in infrastructure, and we still have ways to go. But I think that one of the challenges we face is that people have those experiences still top of mind. Of how the bus system was in 2014, and the first time that when we talk to a lot of folks, they're just like, no, I mean that's I lost trust in that system. That this was a service that government provided. So we still have a long ways to go to rebuild that trust on the DDOT end. That's the only end I face on sort of really this issue, and it's a challenge. And the first time that somebody gives us a chance, and then we cut a bus on a Saturday and it's 2 hours again. It's just like same old DDOT, and that's a tough thing, but it's a real thing that we have to face. Like this isn't something we can blame on customers. We have to blame it on ourselves for the service of the past and this making sure that we're living up to what we're promising to deliver to our citizens.
So the perspective from other cities, I most recently left the Bay Area, and so I can share some anecdotes from some of the experience I felt in kind of the most technologically advanced city of San Francisco, which on the one hand, we have a decent infrastructure when it comes to public transportation. And on top of that, we have all these crazy startups that are trying all kinds of new mobility options within the city center. One of the things that I personally noticed and personally felt when we moved a little bit further to the outskirts, and I've seen this in many cities happening, is really the core of many cities is actually pretty decently equipped with mobility options, with bike sharing and car sharing and all kinds of sharing options. But in the moment, because a lot of cities didn't stay at that little core, they grew and grew and grew bigger. But with that growth, we didn't necessarily plan in some of the public transportation growth. And that's one of the things I personally noticed even in San Francisco is when they started kind of exploring all these surrounding areas that were literally dead. Like, we personally moved to the Navy shipyard, which was dead since the 60s, and they rebuilt this whole community out there. But somehow, in that whole process, nobody thought about that people have to get from that place into downtown again to work and bring kids to school and so forth. And it took really kind of the developer itself to then start a private shuttle service to make it even possible to avoid for people obviously using their vehicles, because parking, whoever has ever visited San Francisco, is really a pain in the butt. So you don't want to really take your car into the city, but for many residents out there, it was no other option. And so it's that kind of thinking, and I know in Germany we do a lot from VW's side, that we work with developers and with city planning to start early in the process to bring in both public and private options to explore how to make sure that mobility is possible for everybody, no matter where they live within the city boundaries and beyond.
Yeah, what I recognized while traveling around the last 2.5 years is that many cities are struggling with the issue of mobility and giving access to everybody. In Germany, it took a really long time to give access, for example, to disabled people with wheelchairs or strollers. So until the transformation has happened there, that we have low-floor buses, for example, and also the pedestrian ways being raised up so that you could easily get into the bus with a wheelchair or a stroller. It took some time, and now cities are transforming again, giving access to non-car-related mobility transportation methods like the scooters or bikes. So in my hometown in Wolfsburg, we now have bicycle ways separated from the street, but not really. And the question is always, how do we divide the space that's there and that's limited within the city to all modes of transportation? And that's not only counting for public transport, but also cars, bicycles, and everything. And I think more people would decide to choose other options if public transportation was as good in their neighborhood as it's maybe in downtown, or even go by bike if there was a possibility, or even have good access with wheelchairs or everything else and have separate lanes on that if that was possible. But most of the time, the pedestrian way has to be shared with bikes, wheelchairs, strollers, everything, so there's not enough room. And the cities I've visited now, everybody is struggling with these kind of issues to really make the space that they have work for everybody and get good quality of life for the citizens, and also access to not only the companies where you work in the cities, but also for tourists, people who come to visit, who want to go shopping, want to spend, a night out, go to restaurants. This is changing the way everybody that sits at the table is discussing about these kind of things.
Great, thank you. Mark, I want to ask you a question. A number of folks brought up public transit in this discussion of the link between access and mobility, which is from the public sector. In innovation, in providing these services, you have to balance both delivering service today, but also kind of being a facilitator for new options. How do you set out your priorities in the role of the city of, kind of guiding or shepherding access to some of the things that Falk mentioned, the actual built environment? Like, how do you actually do that on a day-to-day basis?
Great question. I think that we've centered ourselves as a team. We're a small team. It's only 6 folks, around the idea that public transit is the core of what we are doing, and there are things that we can do that is complementary. So, for instance, we have a pilot that we launched last year in partnership with Lyft and a taxi cab company, where if you're riding the bus between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m., we will give you a credit that basically gets you that another mile and a quarter. Because while, we do run a lot more bus service than we did 5 years ago at 3 o'clock in the morning, our service at 3 o'clock in the morning is not the same service that we run at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So, if you're taking the 4 and you get off at 6 Mile, there's a code to work there. And the idea isn't for a service like that to take away from public transit, but ideally add on to public transit. That said, the idea of this pilot was also to learn, what barriers exist from that to do a service like this. And we've learned a lot. We've learned from a lot of folks just not looking at a quote unquote multimodal trip like that, to look at a decision to take the bus or to take a taxi as a binary decision, not as a complementary decision. So obviously a lot of education work more needed from us. Just trust of giving credit card information, particularly over to a private company like Lyft. That's something new and something that people have issues with. To just making sure those vehicles are out there, so that service is available. And one of the things that we are constantly just hammering Lyft on with this contract is their lack of accessible vehicles that they have, and just sort of that challenge that exists. So we've made sure to not be this other group that's over here, right? Like we are embedded in DDOT and sort of working with all those folks, and we're still learning how we do that, because for so long public transit has been get the buses out on time, and that's how we succeed, and not just simply saying how as a public transit organization do we provide the most amount of public mobility for everyone in the city. And I think that's the thing that's really beginning to change. But at the core focus is we need to get more service out there, we need to get more frequent service out there, we need to do a better job with our customers, we need to improve upon our paratransit, all these aspects that continue to be at the core of what we do. Everything else is kind of things we're learning about.
Cool. And I'm glad that you brought up the Lyft DDOT integration, because I think it's a good example of a new mobility innovation linking with something that we've traditionally thought of as transportation. I had an opportunity a couple of years ago in New York to participate in a challenge called the Mobilized New York Challenge, and it actually worked with the community to identify other mobility innovations specifically focused on folks with various forms of limited access, whether it's social, economic, physical. And there were some really cool ideas that came out of it. One, Jamie, this might resonate with you, and I actually want to ask you this question, is someone who relied on an electrified wheelchair to get around every day. Many of us have one of these in our hands or our pockets right now. That anxiety when the battery starts to go down. The innovation was help me understand where I can plug in so that I can actually get to the bus to get back home. Another innovation was a map for people who have another physical limitation, little steps and stairways into buildings, actually mapping those out so that people know what's accessible. Or when the elevator is out to get down your subway and you go to the stop, well, what are you going to do? And so I'm curious, and Jamie, maybe start with you, and again, we can pass the mic. Interesting and exciting ideas that you're seeing that seek to address and overcome this barrier to access in mobility, whether it's a new service, a new option, a new community effort. What are you guys seeing that is actually moving the needle to tackle this issue?
Let's see, in Detroit, I think we were speaking with some of the city officials, and they were actually talking about making sure that they had access to plugs throughout the city, which as you can imagine, how, again, you feel lost if your phone isn't working. Well, imagine if you are relying on an electric wheelchair to get you from point A to point B and your battery dies. Or covered bus stops in the city of Detroit. That's one of the things that we lack. Covered bus stops that are actually accessible, because a lot of them are on grassy spaces that you can't get on. So that was a neat thing. I know also Google recently came out, like you said, with this whole accessible route and VR routes for people. You can actually turn your phone into like a VR device and go where you're going, which is neat for me because recently I've been taking public transit a lot, taking the Q line and things of that nature to get around. So it's been interesting in that respect. The other thing that I saw that was unique, and it wasn't Detroit, and maybe it's not unique, but in Washington, D.C., they actually have accessible lifts and taxis. They supplement the service, right? So the city sought out partnerships with Lyft and some of the medical transport companies, right? So they merged together, and you can actually use the Uber app to locate an accessible taxi and accessible Lyft right from your phone. So that was neat for me. Taking the subway system was kind of neat for me because I actually had access for once to on-demand transportation, which in the city of Detroit, if you have to use a wheelchair, you don't have access to on-demand transportation. We have something called paratransit, and you actually have to make a reservation. They say 24 hours, but it's more like 3 days in advance. So, you know.
Yeah, I can add one example that, or two examples that we are working on. For example, and you might notice that of course there are bus lines, public transportation, but they are not in every street. So most of the time, if you live in the outskirts, you have to walk at minimum 15 to 20 minutes to get to the next bus station. And we are testing right now a service from Moya, a ride-sharing service with small buses, which is covering exactly these areas, and it's an algorithm behind that which calculates the route so that you get from point A to B. You don't have to walk to the bus station or to the metro station. It's a little more expensive than bus, but also cheaper than a taxi. So, and it's a good addition so that you don't need to have a car or another thing, and you have easy access to mobility and get from A to B. And one other thing that we are testing is peer-to-peer car sharing, so that if you have a car and you drive into the city and you don't need it, then you can get it to the pool so that it doesn't stand around the whole day, but other people might use it, and we can also kind of share the cost. So relieving some of the traffic out of the cities and giving access to other persons to your vehicles is one of the issues that we do. And we're trying to do different things to give more and more access to people to different kinds of mobility, but also reducing the number of cars within the cities, which sounds strange for an automotive company, but we want our customers to be satisfied, and also we would like to have the cities to have more space so that we can actually enjoy living in them.
So I want to share some of my favorite grassroots solutions that I've come across in my past 13 years doing organizing here in Detroit. And as you mentioned before, life before 2010 was rough, but to an extent that it was just, I guess I like to say it was just more creative, because people had more room to build. And one of my favorite things was the Eastside Riders. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of them, but it's this group on the East Side. And so let me give you a little bit of context. There wasn't a whole lot of lights that would be in Detroit. So one of the issues with the late buses was that people were standing around in the dark, and in the morning when people are going to school, that could be kind of scary for young women. And so there was a big lighting issue. And so neighborhoods would be sort of in charge of their own safety. And the Eastside Riders created a program where they tricked out these beautiful bikes. So there's a big bike culture in Detroit, if you haven't seen yet. And they're, Fago is from Detroit. And so they would do stuff like create Fago-themed bikes and ride around, and they were lit up, and they were just amazing. They're really cool. Look them up online just to see the bikes. And this created a buzz of like culture, I guess, within the neighborhood. And what they would do is they would ride around with their lit up bikes at night and patrol the neighborhoods for safety. And then kids would want to get involved because these bikes are awesome. And so other people wanted to learn how to build them. So you could take workshops and learn how to build these bikes if you did some community service and did some patrolling as well. And these bikes did a couple things. Like they offered opportunities for community to work together and to build a culture that like represented them, that then added to the larger culture of Detroit. That was really specific to like Fago-themed bikes. And they also created this sort of like community service model that like allowed for youth to be able to develop the safety of their own neighborhood. And when people are sort of developing their own systems, there's this thing that I guess the best way to describe it is called, like they call it now the IKEA effect. Where people who build their own furniture from IKEA, even though it's like pretty crappy, end up taking care of it way more than they would something that is not, that they didn't build, because there's this sort of connection to building the things that you use. And so in building this sort of community safety, this created a whole other culture within Detroit around neighborhoods organizing and doing their own governance. Including then folks saying, well, hey, like, let's figure out the lighting situation. And so there was a group on the North End in Detroit, the North End Woodward Community Coalition, as well as Solidarity, started then putting in solar-powered lights. And these lights then offered opportunities like, well, maybe we could put routers in them and then create mesh networks. And those mesh networks become like hubs for people to communicate resources. So I just want to give you a few examples of what that looks like when people have the agency to sort of build things on their own, and how it's like there's so many hybrids involved because these solutions are addressing multiple things, right? They're addressing community acceptance, they're addressing mobility, they're addressing access, they're addressing safety and what safety means to individuals, which is very different to different people. And so those are a few of my favorite stories from Detroit and why I think Detroit's like really unique. And then one last thing is to sort of say that the reason why those things happened was because capitalism failed in Detroit. And so just let's remember that, like it dramatically failed in Detroit. There were many companies that shut down, hundreds of thousands of people that left. So the folks that are coming up with the solution were literally building because they had to. And so instead of sort of building the things that we know, I think where we're at right now, and to work towards a new future that's accessible and equitable, we have to be inclusive of people's ideas and be able to put them into fruition. And that requires education, both on the parts of the institutions, but also folks who are just interested. Because like I want to have a say in how the internet's built, and in order for me to do that, I have to know everything about the internet. So where's the opportunity for me to learn that? And so that's something I just wanted to sort of put out on the table.
Thanks. Mark, can I ask you to talk about the Accessible Mogo program and all of the amazing bicycles that are part of our bike share network?
Sure. So I'm not the best person. Lisa from Mogo is. So Lisa Niskowski, she runs Mogo, which is our bike share system here in Detroit. It's 50-ish stations. And she took this project essentially from an idea at Wayne State to running it and expanding it. So she's just a brilliant, brilliant person. But you know, in addition to just the traditional bike share model that you see across the world that we have, we were the first, I believe, city to have accessible bikes, which are essentially three-wheel bikes with one in the front and two in the back, to available for anyone to utilize as well. As in addition to, you know, from day one, she has had an access pass, which for those that qualify financially, it's basically $5 membership to be a part of the program. You know, and she has really set a good model for us to build upon on things anything that we're trying to do to be looking at everyone as potential users, as customers, and it's just really we're lucky to have people like that in the city, in leadership positions that are sort of driving that and pushing everybody else to meet or exceed what she's already doing.
Cool, thanks. I'm going to ask, I'm sure there are questions out there, so maybe can we have this microphone make its way out there? And we'll just do this organically. If someone has a question, move toward the microphone or vice versa. And as that's happening, there's another concept that I wanted to introduce, which is this idea of universal design. And Jamie, your comments actually are very much aligned with the premise of universal design, which I know we've got artists and designers in the room, so if this is redundant, forgive me, but I'm going to assume not everyone knows us. So the idea of universal design is that the design and composition of environment so that it can be accessed, understood, and used to the greatest extent possible by all people. Regardless of age, size, or ability or disability. And the premise is that any environment should be designed to meet the needs of all people who want to use it. And that this is not an exceptionalist idea. It's actually something that is for benefit of everybody, just not a minority of the population. And so I think that what's amazing to me is this movement toward universal design is not about solving any one group or one particular person's problem accessing something. It's this question of the system and how the general design has become a barrier. And if we can overcome that, it's actually better for everybody. So I know there's a question as we talk through it. Again, panel, feel free to react to that as well. If you've got a mic, go for it.
Oh, it's on. Wow, it's a good thing I didn't tap it. Anyway, my name is Ingrid, and my question is for Mark de Vergne. And I am the founder of Drones, as in the little helicopter things, Drones for Girls. And we teach 9 and 10 and 11-year-old girls to build, code, and fly mini drones. One of the things that I'd like to have, and it's, anyway, one of the things that we would like to have is a home in Detroit for mini drones. The whole idea of having a network of pilots, it's a whole other thing. But, and drones do everything. We want girls to know what their options are in the future. How do I get a tour of the municipal airport? I've worked in architecture, I've worked for general contractors, and so I can, like, 30 minutes to walk through some of the empty bay hangars and some of the empty spaces in the airport. How do I do that? Just
You talk to me afterwards. That's amazing. B, drones is not, it's sort of it's a national city expertise that we're lacking. I'm trying to sort of get everybody in the city that is focused on this, from the university to those to you, to be able to sort of build community number 2. And the airport piece, I can talk to you offline after this about that and sort of introduce you to the airport director.
Hi. I really appreciated what Diana said, and I think it's really important, and I wanted to just say that I appreciate it, about the kind of failure of capitalism and what that means, and what it should mean for everybody in thinking about what mobility innovation is and what we take for granted and what we assume about what it has to be. And when we have ideas from people who created because they couldn't take for granted any of those things working, had to create things for themselves, that generates all sorts of new ideas that we might not have thought about otherwise. And I think my question is, what does it mean then to include people in cities in the global south in this conversation who have additional kinds of limitations in terms of infrastructure, but actually remarkably similar to Detroit in a lot of ways? And how does a more inclusive kind of conversation about what mobility innovation is and the kinds of ideas, like Diana was suggesting, that exist or could exist, how does that reshape the way we think about all of this and the kinds of assumptions that we're making about what the future can and should be?
I'll answer, and everybody else can give a much better answer so they can get the time to think. So I'll be brutally honest with you. My background was as a consultant doing traditional transportation engineering, right? And for a lot of that was sitting in an ivory tower saying, this is what we should do. This experience working with my team and being able to work with people in the city has really changed like how I see like how this whole industry needs to be kind of turned upside down. And in a way that is learning from the people that live in the city about how they get around and the challenges that they do. Transportation and mobility is a very personal experience. And you're going to be solving for your problems. And if you don't have input and really understanding and empathy for everyone, you're just going to be solving for yourself all the time. I have vendors come into my office who I just start yelling at because I'm just like, you're solving your problem, right? And like, that's not like something that's going to work here. And it's not even just solving it. It's like, I'll get decks, right, on the future of transportation, and it'll be a bunch of people like walking around super happy, like showing their cell phone, and I was just like, whose experience is this? Like, no one is happy getting around, number one, period. And so I think that this is something that needs to obviously evolve, but evolve quickly. In particularly sort of talking about, I think all transportation planning, but particularly with innovation, and not just sort of like, this is a shiny object, I want a press release, but being able to say like, this is a challenge that we are not addressing properly, how do we innovate around it? And it's different, it's hard, right? Because the people, I'm 40, I'm not that old, but I'm pretty old. I'm doing the same thing for 20 years, right? And having to I've literally changed how my process is. And when you get into particularly government, government doesn't necessarily change at a quick pace. So I think there's going to be a lot of push, and I think that's why like having strong advocates and having really strong resident conversation of saying like, you have to do this a different way is so important. I have better answers now.
May I just one really quick? I'm going to say the thing that is going to make everyone uncomfortable, but that's okay because that's what needs to be said. In order for equity to exist, people who are at the center of the crisis have to be the leaders. So you have to do more than listen. You have to step down, and you have to put people who are in that space as a leader. And I've learned this so much over the work I do, from teaching women how to DJ and how creating just a space specifically for women of color to learn that skill created a whole movement, because the person at the center of the issue was creating the solution. And so Jamie should be a chair on the Mobility Council of Detroit, because she's at the head, she knows all this issues. So I just want to encourage, and we're cool. Like it's, it's part of it, and that's why I'm here, I think. So I just want to say, like, it takes more than listening. It takes like living to be able to address these issues.
Thank you for saying that, and I accept. But I want to double back, because I think I heard the person that was asking this question say, what does it look like when other people engage? And it looks beautiful. It forces us to do what the founding fathers of this country wanted us to do, which was work together and be a more perfect union for the people, by the people. I think it creates this wonderful thing, like Diane said, that capitalism failed. Yeah, it did, but one of the things that I like to always do is look at the cup half full. So I'll say that where capitalism, financial capitalism failed, human capitalism prevailed. And that's what we need more of. human capitalism. And when I say that, I mean use who you are and what you have to create wonderful things, because human beings are awesome, right?
My question is for the Europeans from VW, since you've heard consistently now with the last speaker that there are a lot of people here that want to make things happen and take charge, but we're in a world here, if you read the papers that you've been here, people from Germany, that yesterday the big thing coming out of the GM strike is that everybody's scared to death of the transition to electric vehicles, which are importing green technology because jobs are going, or you become a battery worker. And that's a major disruption that's like coming to the big companies. And also that, you know, even though $3.8 billion came into micromobility, Uber and Lyft and the scooter companies lost that in 6 months. So sustainable capitalistic models, which we rely on, might not be able to fund innovation. So I just thought you might have some stories, antidotes, or helpful European hints about how you get innovation into the city where you might not have those types of partners stepping up anymore.
That's a tough one. To be honest, we don't have the silver bullet to everything at the moment, and it's not possible. So the transformation that we are in is so huge that we're very happy that we are in dialogue with many cities, not only with cities in Germany like Hamburg or Hanover or Berlin, but also with the city of Copenhagen, with San Francisco, New York City. I just been into the city of Orlando yesterday, and the thing that I see is happening is that the boundaries between the corporate world and the government world and maybe other stakeholders that are kind of dissolving, so people are sitting at one table discussing and trying to work out the solutions together. The shift from combustion engines to electric vehicles is a huge effort, not only for us as a company, in terms of also designing new jobs for the people that might not be building combustion engines anymore, because you need less people to build an electric engine than you need for a combustion engine. So we need to design new jobs, find new things to do, maybe in the service world that we are also tapping into, mobility services, and we will need a lot of people there for that to do that. And also in terms of how do we think about the infrastructure that's needed for electric vehicles. So not everybody has an electric charger at home. In the cities, we have, with Electrify America, we're doing a lot of stuff in the US to build the infrastructure there. We are also doing a lot of things in Europe to build the infrastructure for electric chargers. Well, I grew up in a multi-party building, so 16 parties in one entrance, 3 entrances and parking spaces out there. Not everybody the own garage, so we need to find a way to give everybody the opportunity to recharge their car when they need to do it, considering that not everybody does have to recharge the car every day if we have enough distance that can be covered with one battery charge. But also the acceptance for this new kind of mobility is also a mind shift that needs to be done. I have a 7-year-old son, and what he likes most is when he sits in the car is imitating motor sounds. I did not quite cover yet how to teach him what an electric car will sound like, so I'm working on that. But the fascination that we all share, maybe, and even in Detroit for cars, is also sometimes also the sound of these cars. So the transition that we do to have sustainable mobility for everyone and also create the jobs then still needed for the people that already work in our company, and also to provide the access and the services that have to do all around this. This is a huge effort, and we are, thank God, working on these solutions, but we don't have an answer to everything yet. This is also an opportunity for the people that we speak with, like today, to give us inspiration and their thoughts so that we can really create the services better. Because we can only know so much, so that we need to get into a dialogue with everybody so that we can really integrate this. And I think for an automotive company, this is really a first, because in the past, and I know this has been done by every other automotive company, engineers have been developing the cars and they were doing a good job. But I don't know about you, but I found no car where I sit in there and said right from the beginning, everything is 100% the way I would really like to have it. There was always some kind of thing missing or I would have liked. But now we need to do it differently. We need to really integrate it and have it as an ever-evolving process. So it's not a transformation that we're in, but it's an onward journey that I think will never really end.
So I think we're pretty much out of time. I have a closing question for the panel, again, recognizing we've got a few minutes. We all came into this room today with some persona related to access and mobility. It's part of our lived experience for some. For others, it's our privilege to have not considered it before. We're allies, we're designers, we're community members. So we're all at a different place with this journey. So my question for the panel is, do you have any words of wisdom, call to action, single thing that you're really focused on now as you do your work, your advocacy, your design, that you want to share with this group to jointly advance this question of access and mobility together? So I guess we'll just go down the line, and Jamie, we'll give you the last word.
All right. I think from my perspective in my specific role, what I'm living by is truly, I rather disrupt ourselves than being disrupted by others, because then we're more in control. And it goes back to the last question, is also of how do we deal with change, and how can we not counter change, but really live it, embrace it, upskill our workers to participate in that change. And for me personally, I really seek the opinions of our customers. I seek the opinions of our partners, if it's within the automotive space, but also with cities, to really figure out what does that ecosystem of the future look like, and really try to break down all the silos that have built up over many, many years.
So I'm going to build on Diana's last comment. Is like, get beyond your comfort zone, and you need to be uncomfortable. And you need to learn to be uncomfortable and do uncomfortable experiences. And whether that is having conversations with people that have a completely different viewpoint from you, who don't like what you're doing, to taking different types of transit, to doing types of experiences, from simply just spending a day in a wheelchair and just understanding that experience of getting around in the city. These are all, like, you're never going to have that lived experience that others do, but you need to get further. So that would be mine.
Okay, I was listening to you and I wasn't. Okay, so the future is in our hands. It always has been. It's whether or not you'll take agency over it. So my one call to action is to vote. Please vote in the coming elections. If you are resided here in the United States, it's super important. And to think through about education in a completely different way. What I've learned in teaching community members how to be wireless engineers is that I had to think about how not to teach people towards technology, but towards problem solving. Because technology changes so rapidly, people have to learn how to learn on their own. And so we can't be scared of like individual agency anymore. Like, we have to nurture that in order to move towards the future we want to see. And then I'll end by saying, I believe science fiction has immense possibilities in allowing you to dream of what the future can be. And oftentimes revolutions sort of stop at the change. So I'm going to ask you to think about what happens beyond the change. What do you want artificial intelligence systems to do and to be for you, rather than asking companies to do it for you? So my last word is agency, and please vote. Thank you.
Thanks, Diana. So I would like to add on the constant learning. I believe that learning is really the key to future success. Learning about the thoughts of your partners, the stakeholders. So that's what's also Tina said. We have to get into a dialogue. My advice is to really try something, and even if it fails, you can learn something out of it. But to wait for the 120% perfected solution, this will never happen. So start doing something, and then if it's not working, you need to do something else. But we need to keep on trying and then learn and then implement the things. And by time, it will improve and we will come to the right solution. Thank you.
My last word. Oh, okay. So, first of all, a call to action for everybody here in this room. If you live in the city of Detroit, the disability community right now is coming together to ask that the city put in the Office of Disability Affairs. The Office of Disability Affairs won't just help people, well, it will just help people with disabilities. And I want to say, the reason why I say that, I want to say this. Understanding that everybody in their lifetime will experience some form of disability. If we take that word apart, this means painful or difficult. And ability is simply navigation, right? Whether it's through walking, whether it's through thinking, whether it's through feeling, whatever it is. So it's really the difficult or painful navigation process. So when you think about it like that, everybody in their lifetime will experience some type of disability, whether externally or internally. So my call to action would be, if you live in the city of Detroit, join us. We have petitions online, tweet it out. We made a hashtag called Make Detroit Accessible. Tweet it out. Because it's not just for us, it's for everybody. The other thing that I would encourage you to do is never stop being awed by what you see. Because if you wake up every day with this idea that I don't know anything, the world looks so much more beautiful. And innovation can definitely take place, right? That agency, that idea of equity, the idea of creation and relationships, and the idea of equity can reign if we all take time to learn.